Hi, I'm John Guest, and in this little short video clip we're going to look at one of the questions that was set to an article in the September 2015 edition of the Economic Review. So one of the articles was based on professional team sports, and one of the questions was to sketch a diagram to try and explain or show why top footballers earn more than firefighters. So on the diagram here, we've got on our y-axis or vertical axis the wage rate for our footballers and firefighters, and on the x-axis we have the quantity of labour that they would supply. We're going to start off by plotting a labour demand curve for firefighters. Now, if we think about this line for a minute, this is the demand from an employer for a firefighter, and they're going to be determined by their value to that employer, and ultimately this is going to be very strongly influenced by what a customer would be willing to pay a firm to provide a firefighting service. Now, obviously, in reality in the UK, our fire service is supplied through the public sector and is funded out of taxation, but let's just imagine for a minute that it wasn't, and you had to pay a private sector firm a fee to get coverage if your house caught fire and you wanted a firefighter to come out and put the fire out. Well, ultimately, the value of the firefighter to the employer, the firm that runs the firefighting service, would depend ultimately on how much you would be willing to pay that firm for this service. On the diagram, we're also going to add a demand for labour line for star footballers. And you'll notice in the diagram that I have sketched the demand for top footballers to the left of the demand for firefighters. So this suggests in the diagram that you would be willing to pay more for a firefighter, or the firefighter services, than you would to watch a top footballer play. And again, I'll leave you to have a discussion about that to see if you think that that is true. Would people be willing to pay more to have firefighters than they would to watch a top football star? But for the sake of this diagram, let's assume that that is true. So having got our demand for firefighters and our demand for top footballers on the diagram, we're now going to add some supply curves. And to start with, I'm going to add a supply curve for the firefighters. And I've drawn this as a relatively flat line. And you can see this is showing me that a very relatively small increase in the wage rate would lead to a big increase in the number of people who would be willing to enter the labour market and become a firefighter. And having put that supply and demand curve together, we can represent the market equilibrium, assuming this is a competitive market, and this would be at the point here, and we can see that the amount of people who'd offer their labour services to be firefighters would be QF, and the wage rate they get paid would be WF. Now, considering that the demand for top footballers is lower than the demand for firefighters, you might think that the diagram is going to show that footballers should be paid less. The big difference in the diagram is this supply curve, because what we're going to assume here is that a lot more people could potentially have the skills or the ability to become a top firefighter than could become a star footballer or a top footballer. Because there's so few people who could potentially be a Lionel Messi or a Gareth Bale or a Ronaldo, we're going to assume that the supply curve for footballers is relatively inelastic. It's got an intercept here on the x-axis. So what this is sort of intuitively showing is even if we had a big increase in wages, the increase in supply of top footballers would be relatively small because they are in such scarce supply. There aren't very many people who have this ability. So even if we had very, very big increases in wages, there wouldn't be a big increase in the number of star footballers because there's just not enough people out there with that scarce skill or talent. So if we now focus on our demand curve for top footballers and our supply curve for top footballers, we can see that our market equilibrium occurs here at the point where the two lines intersect, and you can see in the diagram that that's going to lead to far fewer top footballers, sports stars. And interestingly, if we get to the actual nub of the question, we can see that the wage that the star footballers WS earn is far greater than the wage in the market paid to the firefighters, even though our demand for the firefighters, our willingness to pay for their services, is greater than our willingness to pay to watch star footballers. So it's this difference in the supply curve for labour that helps to explain this big differences in why professional footballers earn so much more. Obviously, a few other things to consider are whether the labour market is competitive, and in the article, interestingly, it talks about a number of policies that have been introduced to try and hold players' wages down and to create effectively what we might call a monopsony. So these are other things that we could consider and think about in future work. I hope you find the video useful, and thank you for listening.